If you can take your seats, I think we're going to start in just a minute. Welcome everyone. This is a very, very special day for the O'Neill Institute. We're celebrating our 10th anniversary, and on this occasion we have two, quite spectacular events. The first will be just in a minute with the UN Rapporteur on the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And the second is the launch of the World Health Organization Collaborating Center that O'Neill has been designated with. And we have representatives from Geneva and PAHO to help us celebrate that, and a really breathtaking panel where we're going to talk about global health challenges. This afternoon, our very first presentation will be the presentation of the report of the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health's report on mental health. It's, having been really, mental health was my first love. I was the legal director of the National Association for Mental Health in the UK. And brought the early mental health cases to the European Court of Human Rights. This report holds a very special place in my heart, as does Denius Puras, who is the UN Rapporteur. I can say this, Denius, that you have been a godsend for mental health. As you say so beautifully in your report, how there's been such neglect, such discrimination, stigma, isolation, neglect both in terms of political, economic, socioeconomic status, but also in terms of research and treatment. And you've brought that all to light in a series of reports, culminating in this one. No one could have done it but you, with your background. Before becoming Special Rapporteur, and of course even now, Denius is professor and head of the Center for Child Psychiatry and Social Pediatrics at Veneris University. He teaches in the Faculty of Medicine and International Relations. He holds many distinguished appointments. But the one that we're the most proud of is that he's a distinguished visitor with the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law. He's a human rights advocate who has worked for the last 3 decades to transform public health practices and policies and services with a focus on the rights of children, persons with mental disabilities, and other vulnerable and marginalized groups. A true hero of the health and human rights movement, and I take great pride in welcoming him to Georgetown University Law Center and the O'Neill Institute. What we plan to do is have about a 15-minute presentation from the Special Rapporteur, where he will describe his thinking behind the report. And then we're going to have a stellar panel, and I'll introduce them after the 15 minutes. Each of them are going to just reflect for 5 minutes, and then I'm going to host a conversation among our 4 leading experts and allow a discussion with the audience as well. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to be here in Georgetown and O'Neill on a very special day for you, and congratulations. This report, which I presented in June to Human Rights Council, UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, is my contribution to this unique moment. Unique moment as globally mental health is coming out of shadows and is now recognized as a new global priority, finally recognized. And as we know, global movement for mental health, many other networks and organizations across the globe are advocating for more investments to mental health. So on this, everybody seems to agree. When states are urged to invest more in mental health, often the global burden of mental disorders is highlighted as an issue, as well as the need to reduce treatment gap, which we know is huge, especially in developing countries, but even in developed countries. I agree, of course, that mental health needs more investments and parity with physical health. And among other questions, what I am raising in my report is the issue of how global community and states as duty bearers should invest in mental health, and maybe to put in other words, how they should not invest anymore in mental health. My report views the situation from different angles and questions the status quo in mental health policy and services, the status quo which is more or less like 30 years now in global mental health policies and services. And in maybe quite provocative way, I highlight a global burden of obstacles rather than global burden of disorders or diseases, which for me is too medicalized approach, and global burden of obstacles hinders full realization of the right to mental health. Among those obstacles, I have identified three major obstacles, which is a huge power asymmetries still in psychiatry, mental health, differently from rest of medicine, where rest of medicine moved to partnership between service providers and service users. Second obstacle is excessive use of biomedical model and biomedical intervention. And one more obstacle related with two others is biased use of knowledge and evidence. I have been closely following the global mental health scene during the last 30 years, and especially now when I serve for 3 years now as a UN Special Rapporteur on the right to health. I have a unique opportunity to observe and analyze situation within and around mental health policies and services worldwide, including through country missions, official country missions, which I'm doing at least two of them each year. And I have to tell that situation worldwide is grim. And this is not necessarily only because insufficient resources. Yes, there is lack of resources, but not only. Attitudes and prevailing paradigm is the issue to be seriously addressed. I conclude in my report that status quo in mental health policies and services is no longer acceptable, as this status quo reinforces a vicious cycle of exclusion, discrimination, stigmatization, violence, coercion, institutionalization, excessive medicalization, ineffective investments, and helplessness. Some countries perform better than others, of course, but practices which are being replicated, which are brought from developed countries into other countries, are not the ones which are based on modern principles, especially with regard to human rights. In those many countries with huge numbers of children and adults who are deprived of liberty and incarcerated in segregated psychiatric institutions, in these countries, policymakers and professionals inform me, not only me, but also me, a special rapporteur, that they rely on laws and clinical guidance developed in advanced countries and which are internationally acknowledged. When I go to country missions and other activities in different countries and regions, I observe the unfortunate pattern of failing policies and services. First of all, there are no or very, very few or no good community-based services for people with mental health needs. In most cases, no support or just medications, psychotropic medications prescribed, with tendency to overuse them in some regions. Then multiple hospitalizations to psychiatric hospital follow for this concrete service user. And then decision is made that the case is too chronic to keep the person in family, community, and healthcare system. So in the end, ineffective healthcare system is feeding the system of long-stay care institutions with new cases. The disease is deteriorating, conclude professionals, blaming the natural cause of the disorder, while in fact the mental health system itself contributes to a large extent to this self-fulfilling prophecy, hopelessness, helplessness, and stigmatization. Paradoxically and ironically, the region where I come from, the region with highest numbers of children and adults, will you guess where it is? It is the region where I come from, it's Europe. The highest number of children and adults closed in institution is in the region which is not poor region. So this is one of examples that is not just lack of investments, it is about investments being directed wrong way. We have in new EU member states huge European Union funds were used to renovate large psychiatric institutions. So this was the recent development. Two concepts without having sound evidence are massively used to justify overriding of human rights and excessive medicalization. And these two concepts, and to justify and reinforce status quo, and these two concepts are dangerousness, as you know, concept of dangerous, so they're dangerous, this is why we have to lock them up and maybe also treat by force, and concept of medical or therapeutic necessity. Laws allow exceptions, and exceptions tend to turn into the rule. The dominance of biomedical thinking and biomedical interventions during the last 30 years, despite promises to destigmatize the field, did not reach the promised achievements and even contributed to the new wave of discrimination and stigmatization through disempowerment of users of services as passive recipients of medical interventions, which in most countries remain paternalistic and misusing power delegated to psychiatry. Closer relationships between pharmaceutical industry and representatives of psychiatry, especially academic psychiatry, has led to phenomenon of institutional corruption or corruption of knowledge. For example, many common mental health conditions like mild depression, anxiety disorders in many countries are managed in the absence of lack of effective psychosocial interventions, just with psychotropic medications being overused. In many countries with high rates of suicides, like Eastern Europe, where I come from, and as we know, suicide is closely related with societal transformation, the main way to address this epidemics is to prescribe antidepressants and to ignore evidence that suicide is firstly a public health problem and should be managed as such. And with regard to persons with psychosocial disabilities, the key principle of the CRPD, this very modern convention to move from medical to social model and to empower persons with disabilities as rights holders, this principle is largely ignored by policymakers and service providers in all parts of the world. So epidemics of human rights abuses, both within and outside mental health system, is going on, and lessons from the past seem to be forgotten. I will not tell you, no time to tell about lessons of the past, but we should keep in mind good intentions such as lobotomy and others, which tend to be serious violations of human rights in the end. So if we agree to this, let's say, diagnosis, I use metaphor, I mean diagnose, the diagnosis of the system. If we agree with this diagnosis, we should undertake serious measures to address this failure, systemic failure. And cosmetic or symptomatic measures are not working. This is proved already, that all these attempts to improve existing systems are not working. So this is why in this report I call for shift of paradigm from mental health services reliant on coercion and over-medicalization to human rights compliant services based on the CRPD convention and addressing social determinants, contextual factors, human relationships, power asymmetries, rather than continue just fixing the mental health conditions as medical disorders. Biomedical interventions will have their role in the future, I am convinced, but they should not be overused as it happened in many countries, both for people with common conditions and psychosocial disabilities. Medicalization and its overuse is doing now often more harm than good. I recommend different measures in this report that will address imbalances caused by huge power asymmetries, excessive use of biomedical model. I recommend these measures in provision of services, in medical education, in research, and of course in policies, including international cooperation and assistance. Psychiatry is an important player and may have a good future, but for this, it has to rethink its role in the new normative and contextual framework. The existing status quo with huge power asymmetries, overuse of biomedical intervention and biased use of knowledge may be detrimental not only to health and well-being of millions of people with mental health conditions, but also to the image and reputation of psychiatry as a profession. Medicine in general needs change towards holistic and social medicine. I mean, the medicine as a field needs also change. And I think that good future of psychiatry, if it follows more the trend of social psychiatry, psychiatry could become a leader for new medicine, addressing new morbidities and social determinants of health, and not just repairing parts of body and reliant on expensive biomedical technologies. Just to remind us the words of Rudolf Virchow, father of pathology, medicine is actually a social science. There are many attempts in different countries and regions to move away from legacy of coercion and over-medicalization in mental health, and these alternatives should be supported by states and international organizations rather than investments in status quo, which usually end up with constructing or renovating another large psychiatric institution in many parts of the world. There is a need to have critical mass of people and organizations willing to be active agents in this remarkable process of change and replicate promising alternatives worldwide. And through the rest of my mandate, I have 3 more years, I will be looking for states, but also other stakeholders, including professional organizations, of course, civil society, for those who are willing to be among these agents of change and among champions. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now that we've launched the report, we're going to have 3 comments. I'll introduce them, and once they're finished, I'll host a conversation among the 4 panelists. The first one is Eric Rosenthal. He is Georgetown's own JD and an honorary LLD from Georgetown University. We're very, very proud of him. He's been the founder and executive director of Disability Rights International. He's worked and trained people in over 25 countries. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that the reports of DRI have been transformational, have opened our eyes to the kind of truly deep neglect and coercion and isolation that Dennis was talking about. When I was a young person, even younger than Eric, I went into a hospital for the criminally insane as a pseudo patient, and I thought that the conditions were horrible. I'd visited institutions throughout the world, but yet, even today, we see that. Eric was awarded the Brofman Prize to young humanitarian whose work has informed Jewish values. He's had lots of awards from many organizations, and Eric has been also instrumental in helping us assemble this panel, so thank you. Our next speaker will be Sophia Galvan. She is the human rights specialist at the Rapporteurship on the Rights of Persons Deprived of Liberty. She works at the interface of disability rights and human rights law. She's worked at the Inter-American Human Rights Court, and she'll be talking particularly about mental health in this region and with this court. And then our final speaker is Eric Burnham, who is the legal director of the Judge David Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law. For many of you who know mental health, the Bazelon Center was an early and constant pioneer for the rights of persons with mental disabilities. I learned everything that I applied in Europe from the Bazelon Center. He's also served as legal director of the Children's Defense Fund, worked as a senior attorney at the Southern Poverty Law Center, all the most wonderful legal services institutions in the United States. So with that, I'm going to invite Eric to come and give 5 minutes of comments, and then we'll just move sequentially.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, particularly to be back here at Georgetown, where I went to law school, and as Larry's work bringing the first cases to the European Court on the rights of people detained in psychiatric hospitals I was studying when I was here in law school, and really helped direct me towards a career doing work internationally to protect the rights of people with disabilities, especially children in institutions and adults in psychiatric hospitals. This report by Dr. Pouras, it's hard to emphasize how transformational and important this report is. If you think that the world bodies, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, the Pan American Health Organization, UNICEF, are anywhere near as progressive as this, it's important to recognize through his own experiences, Dr. Pouras has really brought a fresh perspective to challenge very ingrained ways of thinking about mental health that are very much pervasive throughout the world, but also deeply embedded in the work of the United Nations. And it is very much my hope that this report is going to truly influence the way international assistance towards the rest of the world does business. When I got my start after being here, and I worked with Ira Burnham at the Bazelon Center 30 years ago, these ideas, challenging the medical model of mental illness, challenging coercive treatment, were what 30 years ago we were working on here in the United States when deinstitutionalization and the rights of people with disabilities was still a fairly new field. The second data point in understanding how important this is that while 30 years ago we were thinking about many of the same things that Dr. Pouras is writing about, sad to say, 30 years later, the problem in the United States are probably even worse in terms of the expansion of a biomedical approach. Much as civil rights has progressed, I think a lot of the kind of old ways of thinking have actually become deeper and more pervasive, and I'm very interested in hearing Ira's critique of where this report would stand. So those two data points, number one, the UN, number two, the United States. In my work, I've gone abroad. I've looked at what's actually going on in psychiatric hospitals, orphanages, and other institutions for people with disabilities. One can imagine that things are bad, but when you get there, when you observe, when you see people held in such atrocious conditions, people held naked, people tied to beds, people fundamentally dehumanized, and yet the health professionals who work at these facilities, odds are that they're well trained, that they come to the world gatherings of the American Psychiatric Association, they're familiar with the teachings of established psychiatry, and the irony that our international models of mental health have pervaded the world, and yet such abuse and neglect is going on a vast, vast scale, is something that is hard to grasp. And these people are truly the forgotten people of the world. We know there are estimates of approximately 10 million children who've been institutionalized around the world. For those who have disabilities, odds are that's a gateway to a lifetime of institutionalization. No international body that I am aware of has even begun to grasp how many adults are languishing away in institutions for the rest of their lives with no meaningful treatment, with no meaningful hope for return to the community, with utter dehumanization and facing the human rights abuses that, as far as I'm concerned, are more serious than any population faces anywhere in the world. It's not just that their rights are denied, their very humanity is denied. They're stripped of their right to make legal decisions. They can't make decisions. If they're abused, chances are the director of the institution gets to decide whether they can go to court to establish their rights. It's a legal procedure known as civil death, when people have their right to legal capacity taken away. But worse, the systems assume these human beings are biologically broken. They can't make decisions about their life. They can't return to the community. So literally millions of human beings, in the name of mental health, are written off, segregated from society, left to die at best, and killed off, frankly, at worst, in conditions that are truly dangerous. Now, when we go and we try to bring about reform, we have some important developments in international law that give us hope for change. The UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, for the first time, recognizes not only that people have human rights, that they have the same rights as all others, but the key provision in the Disability Convention is a right to community integration. So it's no longer adequate to put people away and forget about them, cleaning up the institutions and untying them and unlocking the chains. That's not enough. They have a right to be part of society, part of every aspect of society, and it is our responsibility to make sure that that can happen. So then we're asked, well, if we're going to challenge these abuses, how are we going to bring about reform? And here again is where Dr. Pouros' report is so important, because we've actually started to make progress using international law. And you're going to hear from Sofia Galvan, a lot of the litigation that we're doing is through the Inter-American System, which, to its credit and Sofia's amazing work, has now declared disability rights to be one of its top priorities. It's incredible, it's important, it's path-breaking that the mainstream, most important, and most effective human rights mechanism in the world, the Inter-American System, which is truly at the cutting edge, has now declared it's taking disability to be one of its top priorities. We have been taking advantage of this at my organization, Disability Rights International, filing cases to protect people who are locked away, abused. And what we're saying is, if these people have been tortured, and we've seen people tied down, tortured, sterilized, trafficked for sex, left to die without medical care, the worst imaginable abuses, what we're saying is it's not enough to clean up those facilities. Now, under international standards, they have a right to be part of society. But the tragedy is that even when we succeed, the greatest risk we're facing is that these countries are going to say, well, how do we do it right? and that they're going to look to the United States, they're going to look to other developed countries and say, let's import their models. What do you do when you actually have a transformational opportunity to create new social service systems, new mental health systems in these countries? Odds are the psychiatrists in those countries who've trained at the American Psychiatric Association meetings in the United States or Canada, who are familiar with American models, are going to reproduce some of the very same difficulties that we've had in the United States, and that's the challenge that we're now facing. Oh, we want to have big, beautiful mental health systems just like you. We want to make sure we have, the best psychotropic medications just like you. The vast, vast amounts of money that the United States and other countries like us spend on mental health are now getting translated into these other developing countries. And the idea that housing, social support, community integration, all the things that are the social determinants of health that Dr. Porras are so easily left behind. So it is a true transformational moment, and it is of utmost importance that this report be disseminated as far and wide as possible. I'll stop now. I just wanted to raise attention to, of all the recommendations that he makes, paragraph 91, 93, 94, 94A. End financial support for segregated residential mental health institutions, large psychiatric hospitals, and other segregated facilities. If there's one truly powerful thing that we can do in terms of how we are impacting, is making sure foreign assistance money is used in a progressive manner that supports community integration, that does not reproduce the worst of the American mental health system, but the best of the American health system, because there are actually fabulous things that we have learned, fabulous things that we have seen about people with disabilities, shattering stereotypes, making decisions for themselves, and we know it can be done right. We know institutions can be closed because there are states in the United States where the institutions have been closed. We know people can live in the community with choices and dignity. Let's export the best of what we have and not the worst. And let's implement these ideas that Dr. Porras has raised. Thank you so much.
Hello, good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And I would like to tell you that this report is extremely useful in this moment of the institutionalization that is happening not only globally, but regionally. And in this regard, I would like to share with you something really important that just took place 3 months ago. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued, for first time in history, a statement urging a state to establish supported services for people with disabilities to live in the community. This took place in the context of a very famous case, that is the Federico Mora case. This case was brought by Disability Rights International. Eric and Priscilla have worked a lot on this case, and they are making a big difference. This case was brought to the attention of the Inter-American Commission in 2012 through requesting a precautionary measures order. The Commission issued this order, and the conditions that were prevailing by that time were just terrible. And these conditions are just emblematic of hundreds or thousands of institutions in the region and in the world. There was physical abuse, sexual abuse, torture, use of isolation room, poor health, and everything that was against life and integrity of patients that are under the care of the states and were almost dying. 5 years later, the Commission visited the institution. This visit took place within the local visit to Guatemala last August. and the Commission asked the state to establish community-based services. And this is just incredibly important, because if we think in another very, very emblematic case regarding hospital or psychiatric hospital, there is the case of Jimenez Lopez versus Brasis that just took place 10 years ago. The approach is completely different. In this case, the Commission and the court, in an order of 2006, were just looking at very bad detention conditions, but they never thought about informed consent, legal capacity, and they didn't say anything about live in the community. What the Commission did is a great opportunity for persons with disabilities in the region, for their organizations, to look for change. This was a pronouncement made in the preliminary observations of this visit, but we will publish a report, I think, next March, but this report will be approved by the end of the year, that will be looking into very detailed all the allegations regarding the Federico Mora case. I would also like to say that this report is very important because it's calling the states to include persons with disabilities. This has also a very important statement by the Commission in this report, because the Commission is asking the state of Guatemala to establish community-based services through very different things. For instance, the institutionalization strategy, 2, allocating resources for that, and 3, including persons with disabilities and their organizations. You establish in your report that you expect to make a contribution to this field, and I have no doubt, based of all the development that is taking place now in the Commission, and specifically because there is a new disability unit since May of this year, that it is a great contribution to this field. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ira Burnham from the Bazelon Center. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not a graduate of Georgetown, but I wanted to mention that on our small legal staff, we do have one Georgetown graduate who's here with us, Alyssa George, the Bazelon Fellow. There's an arrangement that we have with Georgetown Law School where every 2 years a recent graduate comes and works for a period of time at the Bazelon Center, and Alyssa is our current and wonderful fellow. I also wanted to thank you for the report. I think for all the reasons that have been described previously, it's an extremely important report, especially as Eric says, in sort of pointing the way forward. I'm not as familiar as the rest of the folks with the international context, so I'll speak, I think, maybe from the American perspective. And to briefly answer one of Eric's questions, I'm a little more optimistic, I think, than Eric is about where we're moving in the United States and the progress that we've made. And I wanted to talk just about 3 or 4 things in the report, in the recommendations in particular, that really resonated, I think, from the American experience. And first is this concept of confronting the global burden of obstacles. So just sort of an idea and a phrase that I love, and it's very kind of consistent with sort of the legal framework, or sort of what underpins the legal framework in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, one of the core concepts in the ADA, which is in the US, the Civil Rights Statute for people with disabilities, is the recognition that kind of the man-made world, which we all encounter, was constructed essentially without people with disabilities in mind. There were no ramps, there were no social supports, there was no anticipation that people with disabilities, including people with mental disabilities, would really be parts of our communities and participate fully in community life. And it really required, in order to accomplish that we all change, and that our institutions and the way we do business in the public sector and the private sector change in order to allow people with disabilities to be parts of the mainstream of American society. So we have in American law, and really a sort of underlying the disability movement in the United States, this sort of concept of, the problem is the system. It's the obstacles that we all create, not really the disabilities of the folks that we're talking about today, the folks with mental disabilities or other disabilities. And then our task is really to figure out a way to organize ourselves and our society to support them and to enable them to thrive and to help and support them in thriving. So that's the first thing I really like. The second thing is this notion of embedding a rights-based mental health intervention in public policy. I may like that just because that's what I do for a living. So we at the Bazelon Center, approach disability and mental disability from a rights-based perspective. We used law in advancing the interests of people with mental disabilities. We understand that law is not, sort of the primary need of people with disabilities, but a rights-based approach does make a difference for the reasons, and some of them obvious, that are described in the report. Our mission at the Bazelon Center is, is really a commitment to self-determination, one of the core notions in the report, and to supporting, through law, people with disabilities being full participants in their society. And so I do think from the experience in the US, but also Larry talked about, approaching this issue from a rights-based perspective is really critical. A third thing that really resonated with me, and it echoes something that Eric said, is the ending an investment in institutional care and redirecting resources now invested in institutional care into community supports. That's really been central to the agenda of the Bazelon Center, really from its beginning. We were very much committed to and involved in the movement for deinstitutionalization, about which we may talk a little later in the day, I understand. And in the US, that sort of concept of community integration as opposed to institutionalization is enshrined in the ADA as it was kind of announced and interpreted by the Supreme Court in a case called Olmstead, in which the Bazelon Center was involved and in which we spent, well, more than a decade trying to implement, as has the United States Department of Justice. But the simple concept there is under the ADA, it is discrimination for people to be needlessly institutionalized. If they can be supported instead in a community setting in their own homes, that is what's legally required, because to needlessly separate someone from society, to segregate them in an institution, is a civil rights violation. It's a discrimination under American law. And that concept as well is very strong in this report, and I know in kind of the international discussion and advocacy. The last thing I want to mention is this concept of developing a basic package of appropriate and high-quality psychosocial interventions. And since the terminology, I think, in sort of the international context may be a little different than the terminology here, I think my understanding is some of what we're looking at is addressing the sort of social determinants of health and mental health. But also in the US context, that would mean psychosocial interventions that are embedded in the mental health system. And I think that, the report in some ways sets up, I know there's sort of, a discussion, it sets up a dichotomy between sort of traditional approaches, which are largely biomedical, and new or psychosocial approaches. And in the US, I think we have the good fortune that, at least in the public mental health system, and I think in its philosophy, certainly in its language, and to a significant extent in practice, we've moved beyond the biomedical model. And psychosocial interventions are really understood to be a part and a necessary part. And so in our advocacy, and both in what we call Olmstead litigation, but also in our public policy advocacy, we actually push often for this concept of sort of a core package of psychosocial supports. In our world, it would be peer supports, which are mentioned in the report, housing, and mental health systems around this country invest in housing. Also supported employment, support for employment, which is just beginning, I think, in the United States and mental health systems and growing. And what's interesting, I think, and we can talk a little bit more about it later, is, well, I think it's true that psychiatry in the United States has remained, very committed to the biomedical model and maybe moving more down that road than one would like, and always likes its prerogatives to be protected, which is part of what's behind forced treatment law. You got to listen to me. I'm the psychiatrist, so I know the right thing. Psychiatry, in some odd way, has abandoned the public mental health system. They don't have a lot of interest in it. It's not where the money is. It's not where the jobs are. It's not where the action is, from the guild's perspective. And so mental health systems have emerged in the United States, increasingly kind of relieved of the burden of psychiatric leadership, if I can coin a phrase. And not that psychiatrists aren't essential, and I do think that biomedical approaches like medication are essential, but they're not as dominant in our system as they once were, which I think is a very good thing.
Thank you for 4 great presentations. I want to lead a discussion around 7 issues, and I'm going to list the 7 because I'm not quite sure we're going to get to all 7, but I wanted to put them on your radar. The first will be on deinstitutionalization and what that means. The second is the biomedical model, and particularly the use of psychotropic drugs. The third is what Eric called civil death, legal capacity. The fourth is the myth of dangerousness. And you just have to look at the firearms debate in the United States to understand that. The fifth is the importance of inclusive participation. In Dr. Perez's report, he emphasized it. I like to talk about social mobilization. He also talks about the social determinants of health and socioeconomic status. The sixth is resources. Again, in this report, the impoverishment of resources that go into mental health. And the seventh, as Dr. Perez said, is this a pivotal moment? After all these years of neglect, does the work of the Sustainable Development Goals, the World Bank, the World Health Organization, PAHO, the Inter-American Commission and Court, does that change everything? So I'm going to be the skeptic and press you. So let me begin with deinstitutionalization. And Dr. Perez could answer this, but so could any of the panelists. Now, historically, if you looked at deinstitutionalization in the United States and Europe, it was really an unholy alliance between the civil libertarians and the conservative Reagan fiscal conservatives. So the institutions were reduced, but at the same time, we didn't invest in the community. And today, in the United States, but all over the world, you can see persons with mental disabilities in prisons, in shelters, homeless on the street, nursing homes, orphanages. We see them in refugee camps and places where people are internally displaced, like the Rohingya now fleeing from Myanmar to Bangladesh. So where are we with deinstitutionalization in terms of truly embracing mental health services and embedding it in the community? And have we displaced many of these institutions, not all of them, as Eric reminds us, with people who are placed in intolerable positions in prisons, shelters, homeless, nursing homes, orphanages? So who would like to begin with that? You've got microphones, so you can just sit and begin. Did you want to start?
I think I talked too much.
Okay, Eric, you then.
I'm actually interested in, Ira's response to the critique of the United States in terms of the alliance between the Reagan people, because when I was at the Bazelon Center and we were working on deinstitutionalization in the early 80s, the Reagan perspective was not considered part of the alliance. In fact, we were suing to get the right to SSDI payments
Yeah,
for people
but in
receiving
California and
supported housing.
places like that, yeah.
Absolutely. The desire to use this as an excuse for budget cutting is clear. It exists and everywhere in the world. I actually think that there are ways in which internationally there's more potential than in the United States. In countries with less money in their mental health system and fewer professionals, in a way, the things, the social determinants of health, housing, community support, non-professional support, peer support, those are less costly interventions. And the irony is that in some ways it's actually easier to do in less medicalized and less developed systems. I mean, there are longitudinal studies. There's a study that was done by the World Health Organization that's been kind of orphaned by the World Health Organization. They don't like to refer to their own study, in which they looked at the trajectory of mental illness and the chronicity of mental illness. And they found that in countries with less mental health resources and less developed mental health systems, schizophrenia is less chronic. People go through a period. There are actually higher suicide rates in the short term, but then it tends to burn itself out. People become less chronic, and then they return to the community. And so there's some evidence that our mental health systems actually perpetuate a problem, and that when we've got the less costly social supports, the village, the small town, the people who just accept someone as part of their society and reintegrate them, it actually may bring about a better prognosis. The other area which is easily overlooked when we look just at mental health is that institutions and asylums are so often dumping grounds for people with such a broad array of disabilities, not just the narrow people who would meet a diagnosis for major mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities, people with no disabilities who become disabled as a result, gay and lesbian, people who are rejected from their society for one reason or the other are put in these dumping grounds. The dumping grounds themselves become generators of increased disability. And the irony is that the success and the potential for reintegration has actually been greater. In the United States, I mean, we look at the homeless people on the street and the people with a diagnosis of mental illness in jail, but we often don't see the extremely successful integration of people with intellectual disabilities into society. And there's a lot more success that we don't always give ourselves credit for that we have to look at. And that's, again, so I think that there is tremendous potential in less resourced countries and a lot of success stories in the United States that we need to take credit for and that we can help share with the rest of the world.
Ira, did you want to comment? And also, I'd like to talk a little bit about the problem in other forms of institutions like prisons or homeless shelters or...
Well, I certainly agree, and I think we all recognize sort of the central concept that people with mental disabilities, people with disabilities in general, are not kind of high priorities for our society in terms of investment and support. And I think it's true that over time, certainly from the height of the period of institutionalization in, say, the 50s, that the investment in our mental health systems in real dollars has probably declined. It certainly hasn't grown with the population. So I was saying, number one, that we have a problem of priority. Folks with disabilities, folks with mental disabilities are not highly valued, often, as the report says, stigmatized, there's discrimination. So society hasn't made that investment. And I think I do think that the U.S. narrative, the sort of accepted narrative of deinstitutionalization, sort of leading to people in prisons and to homelessness, I think is a little exaggerated.
No, that's not the cause.
Let me just say why. So as someone who was also living through some of that period, two things happen that I think are also often not accounted for in the narrative. One is that in the early 80s, when Reagan became president, there was a huge disinvestment in housing. So one of the one of the budget items that got dramatically slashed in the federal budget was the support for housing. And you also had changes then in a lot of sort of the urban housing markets. Say, look at Times Square in New York, where SROs just sort of got eliminated. These sort of single-room occupancy dwellings where people with disabilities or people with mental illness might have otherwise lived and were living. So that's one thing that happened that was quite independent of deinstitutionalization and had, I think, a profound effect on both homelessness and incarceration, because there's also a relationship between those two. The second thing is, don't forget that in the United States, we vastly increased the number of people who are incarcerated. So it would not be off the charts. I forget the figures, but we're still one of the countries in the world that uses incarceration, sort of the most. We used to be up there, we probably still are, with South Africa and Russia, and so if you dramatically increase the number of people who are in prisons and jails, you're going to have more people with mental illness in prisons and jails too. And then, sort of as a subset of that is sort of the war on drugs, because the plurality, most people who are in prison and jail with mental illness are there because of a minor drug charge. And so you put together dramatically reducing our investment in housing, changes in the housing market, huge increase in incarceration and the war on drugs. And that has a lot to do with the picture we see in the United States. I think it's also true, as Larry alluded to, that we've crossed, there's been a lot of trans-institutionalization within sort of other facilities, not criminal justice facilities. A lot of people moved into kind of boarding care homes. They're basically kind of lousy apartment dwellings for people who don't have a lot of money. And then also a certain number of people moved into nursing homes. And you still see that today. So one of the things that we've kind of set as a priority for ourselves at the Bazelon Center, even before the Olmsted case, was sort of what we used to call deinstitutionalizing the community. So yes, people moved out of hospitals and large institutions, but they didn't end up supported in their own homes often.
Okay, maybe we should move on to treatment and the biomedical model. A number of you have talked about, and it's in the report, of the importance of psychosocial models, the socioeconomic determinants of health, rather than medicine. And the report also talks about the vast overprescription of psychotropic drugs. I just want to reflect back. I mean, a number of years ago, I was at a World AIDS meeting, and I had heard UNAIDS get up and announce it's getting to zero. And then I heard a Harvard researcher talk about the fact that antiretroviral treatments could virtually, in fact, he thought did, when well taken, eliminate transmission, so-called treatment is prevention. And that was just stunning. I just put down my notes and I just thought, who would have, people who lived through the AIDS epidemic, who would have ever imagined it? And then I thought for my early days in mental health and how little had been done. The early psychotropic drugs, Largactil and things like that, would cause tardive dyskinesia. And everybody always thought people in mental hospitals, this was the mental health problem. That was the treatment. And then we had a new class which caused, obesity, diabetes, heart disease. How could it be that we've made so little progress over so much time? And I attribute that to a very important point in Dr. Perez's report, which is the lack of social inclusion, participation, and really social mobilization, fighting bottom up for change. So could one of you reflect on, where we are in the mental health system, just in terms of how we approach it medically? You start. I think, yes, you've got this right there.
Thank you. So this is probably most controversial part of my report, because I am receiving, during these 4 months, I am now receiving many supportive comments, feedback, but also critical, for example, from psychiatric organizations, that the question is that maybe biomedical model and biomedical interventions do not deserve such critical approach. But there is a lot of evidence that these promises which were given 30 years ago, and all these concepts in advance of chemical imbalance and so on, now are disqualified. And the psychotropic medications, all groups are in some trouble to prove that they're really much more effective than placebo, let's say. We know this about antidepressants, about antipsychotic, and also controversies around treatment of ADHD. It again, for me, does not mean that biological interventions are not needed, but the idea was to convince everyone that we can cure these conditions because they are the same diseases, like, let's say, infectious or diseases. And I still have a problem when I read otherwise good textbook and suddenly I read a sentence: there is no cure from autism so far. What is this message for parents, for autistic people? As if autism is some disease which can be cured. So this, I think, this was some false promise, and now biological psychiatry is in crisis. And some more and more academic psychiatrists they acknowledge this. What instead is the question, but we really cannot rely so much, especially in many countries, as we are talking here, who are learning from developed countries. Psychiatrist now is the one who prescribes medications. That's it. The psychotherapy is not for psychiatrists, it's for psychotherapists. Psychiatrists mean biological psychiatrists. And when these psychiatrists read the report, like, it's not only my report, it's UN resolution recent on mental health and human rights, which warns about over-medicalization. It's increasing recognition that this biomedical model has gone too far. And now we have to rethink and, of course, to leave what is good in this biomedical model. But for sure, it is overused. And back to the first question of institutionalization, the paradox which I learned in many countries, one of them was Croatia, a very ambitious new EU country. They do a lot in social welfare system to deinstitutionalize. Each year, they deinstitutionalize like 600 people from institutions. There are about 4,000 in small country. But the same year, 600 people are coming, new cases from healthcare system through medicalization. They fail, and finally they tell, oh no, let's send this person to institutions. So for me, this was painful paradox that the institutional care system is fed by medicalized healthcare system. And the promise was absolutely different, opposite.
Yeah. Anybody want to comment on the medicalization or the social mobilization?
Yeah, I think it's true, and we can all agree that there's been, sort of too much emphasis on the biomedical model. There's too much prescribing. But I think that it would be a mistake to think that psychiatric medication isn't important, an important piece of the treatment system. And I think part of what you're seeing is these folks are getting the medical care, right? The people we're talking about in institutions and in public mental health systems are all poor. They're all highly stigmatized. And so the medical care they get is not so great. And it's from professionals who are often not so good. I mean, if you, in part because I have a fair amount of experience with this with friends and family, you know, if you got psychiatric care from a highly trained psychiatrist in the U.S. who was actually listening to you, who wasn't exercising dominion over you, but who was working with you, as I think, you know, probably if any of you went to a psychiatrist, that's the experience you would have. They wouldn't treat you as chattel or as having no capacity. You can, you know, you can obtain medical care. I think that really makes a difference. And I think a lot of what we see in terms of the abuse of psychiatry, both in the U.S. and overseas in public systems, is a reflection of poverty, but I think also what you importantly said in the report, this power imbalance, that the whole dynamic would be much different if psychiatrists didn't have and take advantage of the option, I think far too frequently, of saying, well, if you're not going to listen to what I tell you to do, you know, I'm going to enforce my will. And you know, there may be differences of opinion about whether it's important that there be some circumstances under which legal coercion is used, but I think it's pretty clear that most of the time, including in the United States, when there's legal coercion, it's not because someone's dangerous. It's really because the person isn't doing what the psychiatrist or the family member thinks should be done, and it's just, you got to do it, which is not a really good way to have a healthcare relationship or to help people get better.
From the Inter-American Commission, we cannot talk exactly from a medical perspective, but we can talk about from a human rights perspective. And from that sense, I think that for the Commission, it's really important to look for the guarantee to the right of health based on different aspects that have not built a development through its jurisprudence yet, because the disability area is still very new to the Commission. And in this sense, the Commission has to ask the state to guarantee the right to health through having a process of deinstitutionalization, to have informed consent and respect legal capacity. And in this regard, I think that it's very important what the report said in one of the paragraphs, that it says that institutionalization of persons is not only against the right to liberty or legal capacity, but also the right to health.
I think I'm just going to ask one more set of questions, then open it up to the audience, because I want to get some questions in. But would anybody like to refer to what Eric called civil death? I remember back when I was bringing cases to the European Court or the UK Supreme Court, I was struck by the fact that, you know, that in many cases, my clients couldn't vote. They had limited access to the courts. They couldn't have control of their financial affairs or their bodily integrity, association, expression. And even in many of these institutions, they couldn't even fall in love. You know, they couldn't, you know, be with someone else. I mean, that's, you know, as Eric so articulately said, this is not just a human rights violation, it's a humanities violation. Anybody want to think about how we can get around that? What is the role of law? What is the role of stigma, of society, of inclusion? And then I'll ask the second question, and then you can reflect or not, and then we can go, is this really a turning point? You know?
I mean, probably the most innovative provision of the new UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities is Article 12. And Article 12 establishes legal capacity, the right to make choices, as an inalienable right. It's a new way of thinking about it. Most people, you know, just having people grasp, well, of course we know mentally ill people can't make decisions. What can that possibly mean? And the idea that it's an inalienable right to make choices over your life, and it's society's obligation to provide support and help you make those choices rather than to take away. So we now have a standard that is profoundly important and has, you know, in terms of almost every legal system around the world, really forces major changes. in the central table, Ana Abashidze is an attorney from the Republic of Georgia, and they were able to take this standard and have their laws struck down, and they are bringing cases. Every single person in the institutions has now, as a result of this international standard, suddenly reacquired their right to make choices, and they're doing a whole deinstitutionalization process, individual by individual, because now every person has a right to walk out of the institution and make those choices. So is it a turning point? In the Georgia model, which we see, at some level, it's a turning point. And yet the challenge is that we know that it's so much more than just a change in law that's going to make a difference. And that the creation of these supports, which cost money, is obviously going to be profoundly important. And then that deeper issue, which I tried to grasp and I tried to express early on, until society understands that people can make choices, until society treats these people as human beings that really should be part of the community, it's so hard. You can have the best laws on the books. And so I see countries feverishly rewriting their laws as a result of this, and I see them not being implemented. I had another story out of the Republic of Georgia where we met a woman in an institution who was angry and violent, and we asked, why is this woman so angry and violent? And so we met the person who had been designated under the new approach to the law was that instead of having a guardian, everyone would have an institutionally appointed supported decision maker. And so they had replaced the old system with the new system that was supposed to comply. And the supported decision maker said, well, you know, she was very calm until she had a baby. She was apparently admitted while she was pregnant, and she's nonverbal. And so, of course, we took her baby away from her, and she became extremely violent. But she never told us that she wanted to keep her baby. And, you know, it was like this was all within, this, you know, a minute or two. And so the deeply embedded concepts that people can't make choices, that a woman with a disability can't keep her child. You can have the greatest laws, and until those attitudes are changed, it really is an enormous challenge to implement it. So I think at some level, the law, the report that Dr. Porras has done is an educational tool that we now have to live up to, and that it's not just about straight, direct legal implementation.
Yeah. And the seething anger, you know, for those of us who've actually been there and seen the kind of dehumanization, it just sears on you. I mean, we just did a clean out of our basement just yesterday, and my wife showed me just a very old photograph of a young Larry Gostin sitting on the floor with a young Japanese, an old, very old Japanese man, toothless. And then I recalled we were sitting on the floor because he had been in that isolation room for 30 years. He could no longer walk. They would throw many of them in to bathe just in a big vat. So when you see these things, and you know, you like to think, well, this could never happen today, but you know, DRI's reports show that these things do happen today. And so we need heroes and heroines like we have here. We need you as young future leaders to actually care about persons with disabilities and mental disabilities, and to really do what's right. So, questions?
Hello, thank you. I am wondering, your discussion about medicalization made me think that this report is starting to challenge private interests and economical private actors who are responsible of this status quo, like not to change, like medicine and psychiatrists, and that's actors. And I think that international community itself talk to states and not to to private actors. So my question is, what can the international community, I think this is a first step, but what else can international community do to address these private interests?
I'm going to take a few more questions and then turn it over to the panel. Who else would like to go back?
I have a question on also medicalization, and it's related maybe to another decision from the Inter-American Commission. It's a precautionary measure, Irene versus Argentina, and I think it's it looks a lot like a decision of the Constitutional Court of Colombia in terms of that it's very protectionist. It gives a lot of everything what they're asking in the case, which is like more like an education case. But all the supports in education are being given or provided by the medical system, actually. So my question is, do you see a link in medicalization in education, and then how this could generate a need in the future for more medicalization of those persons who receive medical supports in education?
Pardon? Didn't understand the question. Well, let's see if there's one other, and then maybe the others could do that. Is there one more? Yes, last round of questions, then I'll just turn it over to the panel.
Thank you so much for this panel discussion today. I just wanted to ask how you think we can better ensure that self-advocates and people with disabilities themselves are a part of panels like these and other gatherings to make sure that it's not just talking about people, but it's also including them and consulting them in the conversation.
Excellent. All right, who wants to start off? Maybe you take one of them about the Inter-American system.
Sure. Well, regarding the case of Irene, I think this was a precautionary measures petition. So unfortunately, sometimes, precautionary measures order cannot be very broad regarding the violations or the steps that the states need to get done to alleviate a situation. So from also an advocate perspective, I will suggest that maybe you will look the way to present a case. That way you will have the precautionary measures petition, but also the possibility that the commission make a pronouncement regarding a substantive violation of a right. So I could say that.
Ira?
The issue you raise, if I understand it, is an issue that actually has sort of troubled and plagued to some extent disability advocates in the U.S. So, and sometimes we think about it as the difference between equal treatment and special treatment. And, in most civil rights law, when you think of discrimination, say there's discrimination against, people of color. And color is irrelevant to whatever the circumstance is. What's true about disability often is that the disability is relevant. And the ADA is structured to, first, disparate treatment that's just outright, where disability is not relevant, that's discrimination under the ADA. But the second concept in the ADA is this concept of accommodation, of changing how we do business to make sure that people with disabilities can fully enjoy the benefits of the public system, the private system, whatever. And so when you deal with these kind of situations, often you're making a claim that's particular to people with disabilities. A legal claim, like a claim under the ADA or the Special Ed Act in the United States, or a claim under the Medicaid statute. But you're saying because this person has disabilities, they're entitled to certain things. And generally, those things are the kind of things that our legal system or societal system thinks is appropriate for people with disabilities. I mean, and it's organized around systems. A system might provide, like a mental health system might provide housing, and because that person is enmeshed in the mental health system, maybe they get an entitlement to housing, but because you have a disability, you don't have an entitlement to housing generally. because people in our society don't. You know, if you looked at it from an equal treatment perspective, you wouldn't be entitled to any more social supports than people without disabilities. So I don't know if I'm sort of making sense here, but the problem is that when you litigate or do advocacy around a system that's specific to people with disabilities, you often get into this conundrum. You have to accept some of the central premises, and legally, you have to, you know, you're always making claims that are based on sort of a notion of special treatment as opposed to equal treatment often. So,
I mean, perhaps somebody wants to reflect on perhaps the most provocative question that was asked about the voices of individuals themselves and not experts on this panel, on other panels, and it goes to the point of autonomy, it goes to power imbalances, it goes to social mobilization. So what's the solution to that? Because I think what we've learned with so many other health hazards and health problems is that the voices of people who are affected are critically important to transforming policy, funding, research.
I think this is the crucial issue. Also, it's about ending with all these concepts of civil death, like legal incapacity. And for me, it's paradoxical that the common sense, which we think is what is normal, is very often doing terrible mistakes. So it's about all these conventional wisdoms, which are products of prejudices, superstitions, so that they're dangerous, they are incompetent, and they cannot decide, and we will decide on their behalf because we know what is better for them.
And it's been going on for thousands of years.
Yes, and every time these mistakes, and again, and once we have to learn from these mistakes, and now CRPD is a tool, and the movements of people with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities, and it's also about research when I also tell in my report that qualitative research is as important as quantitative, and lived experiences of these people. This is evidence and not delusions, like some maybe professionals will tell. This is person who diagnoses everything, what he or she is telling is delusions. So this is a problem of professional then to think so. So and this is actually I'm not afraid of the word revolution in this case. So this is peaceful revolution, and I think that we have to use this very powerful movement. These are the people. I'm proud I know some of them who were part of CRPD process, and they are now challenging the status quo. And one of my duties, one of my obligations was to take their testimonies and experiences as seriously as what professionals are telling, and try to find consensus.
Well, you know, it may be, you know, I'll leave it for all of you to think about whether we are at this transformational tipping point. We do have the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which has normative standards that we need to really implement on the ground and do that globally. We have the first UN rapporteur on the right to health that's really focused in this area and has brought attention to it. In terms of social mobilization, perhaps the greatest illustration of what that can achieve apart from AIDS was the Americans with Disabilities Act, a coalition of disability rights movements from across a whole range of movements that came together and fought for a transformational statute. But whether this will be the time when hundreds of years of neglect and myths and civil death and myths of dangerousness, whether that really will change, I don't know. I know that last year the World Bank and WHO held a big meeting at the World Bank's annual meeting, and there was a lot of people on the panel. Everybody said this was it. This was the new moment. And I was the skeptic because I've seen it years, decades, centuries. Will this be the moment? I really hope so, and I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel for help trying to drive this moment to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I wanted to, this has been a very special day for the O'Neill Institute. It's a day when we're celebrating our 10th anniversary, and no one would have imagined that we would have been able to do what we have. What our mission is I'm very, very proud of, is that we use world-class scholarship to make a difference in the world. So we're not simply, scholars in our ivory tower, nor are we advocates, but we use the best available evidence, norms, governance to try to make a difference in the world. And we're going to be having a spectacular panel talking about the greatest health challenges facing the world today. Everything from global health security and infectious diseases through to chronic disease and non-communicable diseases, and access to safe and affordable and effective quality drugs and vaccines. And although it wasn't advertised, injuries are also a critically important part of the global health framework. It really is a special day because earlier this afternoon, Dr. Denius Puras, the Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, is there. He's very shy, so he launched his global report on mental health. We had a wonderful panel talking about global mental health, the historic neglect and isolation, and through to whether or not this is a turning point with the Sustainable Development Goals and with the World Bank and World Health Organization, promising that this would be a new era in mental health. What we're going to do first is have the designation of the O'Neill Institute as a collaborating center of the World Health Organization and Pan American Health Organization, something of which I'm very proud. We've all worked so closely with our friends and colleagues in Geneva and Washington and in the region and globally that this is very, very special to us. And then we'll follow it with a panel discussion where I'll introduce the panel. They'll all just take about 3 minutes each to give opening reflections. Then I'm going to lead a conversation about the greatest global health challenges, and then we'll have audience discussion. Before I do any of that, I wanted to recognize people at the O'Neill Institute who've really not just made this possible, but really built the Institute to what it is today. Oscar Cabrera, our executive director, is here. Katie Gottschalk, our deputy director, is here, and she's done so much for this event. Bridget Rader has worked tirelessly, Megan Gallagher, and we have somebody that I can't fail to acknowledge, even though she's gone to the medical school, with Ed Healton here, the dean of the medical school, Susan Kim, and she means a great deal to us. So I just wanted to thank all of you for that. And now for the presentation of the WHO Collaborating Center, I wanted to introduce a very dear friend. We've worked together for so long in global health, Rudiger Kretsch. Rudiger has come all the way from Geneva. He's still fresh as a daisy. He's the director of the Office of the Assistant Director General and Health Systems and Innovation. Before that, he was the director of the Department of Ethics and Social Determinants of Health and the director of the Department of Ethics, Equity, Trade, and Human Rights. He has a distinguished background from Germany and really globally on socioeconomic determinants of health, which has really been a pioneer for a long time. He's really the voice and the conscience of WHO in terms of social determinants, human rights, and the use of the law. So I just wanted to thank you so much for making the effort to come all this way. And I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll hear more later from you on the panel.
So, dear Larry, distinguished colleagues from the panel, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I think in the last couple of years we've learned quite a lot and better understanding how different sectors contribute to health. We also much better understand the commercial determinants of health that can harm people's health and put additional burden on health systems. There is, of course, a range of tools that we all use to advance people's health. Getting the evidence on which strategies are effective, collecting and analyzing experiences on what works and what doesn't, building consensus, just to name a few of them. Another powerful but sometimes underutilized tool for safeguarding and promoting the public's health and safety is law. Soda tax in Mexico, salt limits in South Africa, plain tobacco packaging in Australia, national health insurance in Ghana, mandatory motorcycle helmets in Vietnam, lead-free fuels in Europe. They're just some of the hundreds of examples of the vital role of the law plays in safeguarding and promoting good health around the world. There are many different justifications for public health regulation. These include reducing externalities, such as protecting non-smokers from secondhand smoke or improving vaccination rates, or increasing the production of public goods, such as improving air quality or vector control. There's providing consumers with information about harmful goods, such as health warnings on tobacco and alcohol products. Providing consumers with information to help them make healthier choices, such as front-of-pack nutritional labeling. Reducing the health inequalities that have emerged and persisted during the process of economic and social development. The goal of health for all was powerfully expressed in the Alma Ata Declaration in 1978, and we're going to celebrate 40 years of this next year, and the Rio Declaration on the Social Determinants of Health, which is about 6 years ago. The O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University has made a substantial contribution to global health through its highly strategic priority setting, through its intersectoral outreach, and through personal dedication, such as shown by you, Larry, and your team. The Institute has become a trusted partner in health law around the globe. It has demonstrated its added value for WHO's partners and indeed to us in the Secretariat in setting up or reforming public health legislation. This is why we have decided together at the O'Neill Institute and in WHO to work closer together. Being a WHO collaborating center is our expression of the closest form of working together. It is built on previous experience, how we have cooperated in the past. It is an expression of high esteem for the quality of work of the partner institution, and it is a sign of trust. WHO collaborating centers are key institutions with relevant expertise distributed throughout the world. They represent a valuable resource as an extended and integral arm, one could say, of WHO's capacity to implement its mandated work. The reputation, integrity, and authority of WHO depends on the quality, independence, political neutrality, and relevance of our work. You are now part of the organization. Dear Larry, I'm looking forward to this cooperation. I'm sure that you will use this role with the necessary level of diligence and care. Thank you very much. And as an expression of this trust, I would like you to come over here now. Now this is very special. This is the WHO flag. And we're going to get this out here.
Thank you.
And show and...
So we just won the World Cup. And we just hold the flag up.
So that's holding the flag. This is really the expression. We can put this somewhere here for today.
Oh yes, that's a good idea.
Right, so that we can put this here. And as I said, this is an expression of trust. There's not many institutions that actually we give the status to. In health law, there's very few around the world so far. The issue of when you're now talking, you can put this on your letterhead, for instance, that you're a collaborating center as of now for a certain period of time. But it says a lot because people will think that this is WHO and this is it, right? So therefore, take it with care, say the right things, but do say them. Thank you very much, Larry.
Thank you. Well, that was nice. I want to now turn to the substance of this evening, and I'm sure we're going to meet the same standards that we did with our mental health report this afternoon. We have, a truly spectacular panel. What I'm going to do is I'll briefly introduce each one of them, and then they'll come and take their seats. Each will talk for about 3 minutes, and then I'm going to host a conversation. And the talks will be in this order. The first talk will be Dr. Anthony Fauci. Tony has been the director of NIAID at the National Institutes of Health since 1984. He's been involved in literally every major infectious disease challenge that the world has faced, from HIV/AIDS to respiratory infections, diarrheal infections, tuberculosis, malaria, and emerging diseases like Ebola and Zika. And he's been a very close advisor to 5 consecutive presidents. At a recent conference, I think I referred to you, Tony, and you might have left at the time, as just simply a national treasure. There's no other way to put it. And for me, the epitome of that was when he was spoofed on Saturday Night Live, with all that entails. Our next speaker is going to be Margaret Ann Hamburg, Peggy, if I will, because we've been friends for such a long time. She's the 21st Commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, one of the longest serving from May 2009 to April 2015. Before that, President Clinton appointed her as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. She was a senior scientist for the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the Commissioner of Health for New York City Health Department. She's currently the global guru of the National Academy of Science and the National Academy of Medicine. While at FDA, I can't think of anyone in the world who's done as much to assure the safety and quality and effectiveness of the global supply of drugs. She's protected Americans, and she's actually protected the globe. Thank you, Peggy. Our third speaker is Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. Bonnie is the coordinator for threat reduction programs in both the Obama administration and the current administration. She's the Department of State lead on the Nuclear Security Summit. She's taken a leading role in the Global Health Security Agenda, and for those of you who know that, it's really the leading global program on trying to keep the world safe. And it's a beautiful vision of America as being outward looking and understanding that strong health systems everywhere is the best protection, not only for the United States, but globally. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise. Dr. Francisco Becerra Bosada is the Assistant Director of the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, here in Washington, responsible for health in the Americas. He serves 35 member countries and territories in this region. His programs of focus are enormous and consequential, from family, gender, and the life course through to health systems and health analysis. And PAHO, for those of you who know it, has just been a remarkable organization, in my view, the model of what a regional office of the World Health Organization can and should be. And then I won't reintroduce Rudiger, but he will be is an American expression, cleanup batter. It's a good place in the batting order to be. So with that, Tony, do you want to come up with a few minutes, and then we'll have Peggy, and then we'll all take our seats, and I'll begin the conversation. I think you can, yeah, do. You're pretty good stand up.
Okay, thank you, Larry. It's really a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to take, as Larry said, or at the most 4 minutes, to just maybe set the stage for what I hope we'll be able to discuss here this evening. And it has to do with something that's very peculiar to Washington, and it's actually a story, an anecdote. When President Trump was elected in November of 2016, the time interval between his election and his inauguration in January, as you well know and remember, that they had at least designated who the members of the cabinet would be. So his entire cabinet was essentially picked. Some were confirmed and some were not. And Dennis McDonough, who was the outgoing chief of staff of President Obama, did something very collegial. He called a meeting at the White House in January, before the inauguration, of all of the cabinet members to be of the Trump administration, for the purpose of giving them a feel of what this administration might expect to see as an unanticipated crisis in the first year of the presidency. And what he did is he did a tabletop exercise, and he said, possibilities. One, a terror attack with bombs and bullets. Two, another Hurricane Sandy. Three, a cyber attack. And four, a pandemic outbreak of an infectious disease. Now just think, we've already had three of those already, and we're not yet past the first year. We've had a cyber attack from Russia. We've had multiple hurricanes, and we've had a terror attack with bullets in Las Vegas. So my job, together with Secretary Burwell and Tom Frieden, was to tell them a little bit of experiences that we've had over the period of time, as well as even prior to the Obama administration. So I had the opportunity, since, as Larry said, I've had the privilege of being in my position through 5 presidential administrations. So I very quickly outlined the kinds of things that can happen, and I think you're all aware of that. Reagan walked in within a few months of the time he walked into the office in 1981 was HIV/AIDS. George W. Bush also had that. Clinton came in, he had AIDS, he had West Nile, he had antimicrobial resistance. George W. Bush came in, and within months he had the anthrax attacks, and then he had the H5N1 pre-pandemic, and then he had SARS. And then Obama came in, and poor Obama, within 4 months of his inauguration, he had the first influenza pandemic of the 21st century, the H1N1, followed by Ebola, followed by Zika. So the message in my closing couple of seconds is that unquestionably we are going to have a global health crisis of some sort in the arena of infectious disease. There are other types of crises, but it may come within the next few months, it may come in the next year or two, but the critical issue is that we absolutely need to be prepared for it, and that's what I hope we'll be talking about in the discussion. So I'll stop there, Larry. Thanks.
Thank you.
Little gymnastics here, too. Well, I'm not going to tell a story, but I thought I might begin by just sort of highlighting a few sort of high-level themes and maybe drill down slightly about some of the challenges before us. First, as already has been touched on by both Larry and our WHO colleague, it is critically important, especially now, that we engage in science-based, evidence-driven policy making, that we work across the best of science, address critical and unmet public health and medical care needs, and we think about the tools we have to advance our work, recognizing that law is a very, very critical element of all that we do and the actions that we can take. We also, I think, have to think comprehensively about what does it mean to talk about health systems, and importantly, to build health systems in countries and regions around the world. And it's more than just medical care delivery. I don't think I probably have to tell all of you that. It's also population-based health and public health. It's also thinking about the investments and the activities in research and development that are part of a health system to ensure that we can deliver on the promise of science and technology, and to make sure that we are continually learning about what works and what doesn't and applying that knowledge. It also means, and as the former commissioner of the FDA, I have to say that we have a system that also ensures that products and food in our health system are high quality, that our medical products are safe and effective, or at least that the benefit outweighs the risks, and that we also recognize the importance of supply chains and appropriate use. We obviously have to look at what is the burden of disease. No one can talk about infectious disease threats better than Tony, and he has already underscored how these kinds of threats rise to the level of the presidency and beyond in terms of their import, the impact on individuals, families, and communities is huge as well. We also have to, as we think about the burden of disease, recognize that chronic diseases are taking an increasing toll in low and middle income countries, but has been less appreciated in terms of global investments in health. But now is the time to make sure that we're making a difference, that we are delivering on what we already know. For example, cardiovascular disease and stroke is the leading cause of death in many parts of the world. We have safe, effective, and actually cheap drugs to treat hypertension, but the majority of individuals with hypertension may not even know that they have hypertension and are likely not getting treatment. Tobacco actually remains the most preventable and leading cause of death and disease around the world and in this country, and we've done a great deal with the law as an important tool, much more that needs to be done. And I also want to say, and it may be in politic at this institution, but this is a critical time to address issues of women's health and reproductive health as we see the gag rule in place now internationally and restrictions on access to birth control in this country. We know that appropriate birth spacing and choices about fertility make a huge difference in the health of women and children. Also, especially in developing economies, the ability of women to decide when and how many children to have enables them to advance their education, to have more meaningful roles in society, actually have healthier families, and to advance a safer, better world for all. So I think those are some of the important ways to think about health challenges before us.
Hello, everyone.
Yeah.
First of all, I want to congratulate you on being a collaborating center. I also want to let everyone know I'm actually not in the government anymore. I left the government in January. I now work at Brookings Institution and University of Pennsylvania. So that is.
I'm not sure that's working still.
Hello?
Oh,
There you go. Okay. So yes, now I'm at Brookings, and I'm at the also at the University of Pennsylvania. I have a joint fellowship, but I still work in the area of global health security. And I think what I would like to just talk about very briefly, and we'll have some more discussion on this, is the global health security agenda. I think one of the successes of the agenda is the fact that I am not a doctor, I'm not a vet. I am actually a lawyer. I got my master's here at Georgetown. And I'm a security person. And one of the things that's been very successful about the global health security agenda is that it's been able to have a match and an integration between health and security. So whereas my background has been biosecurity and worrying about the man-made intentional uses of biological weapons, I've been able to work a lot more with people who are working in health, development, law enforcement, and that's been really successful, I think, for the global health security agenda, because one of the basic premises of the agenda is that we need to have a multi-sectoral approach to how we prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease. So it's been helpful because now I find myself going to talk to universities and the vet schools and the medical schools. Even though I don't have the background, I feel as if now I can really talk in that lingo, because we really recognize that if we're going to combat disease in the future, it has to be a multi-sectoral approach. Also, in addition to that, is the fact that it has to be what we call multi-society. And the global security agenda has been very effective in bringing in institutions outside the government, whether academic institutions, whether they're philanthropy, research, private sector. We've been able to bring a lot of those entities who are outside government into this effort, because we realized early on that the government cannot do it by itself. There are a lot of actors outside government, like Georgetown, who are involved in the issues of infectious disease, and we need to bring them into this effort because it's a huge effort to try to prevent, detect, and respond and build capacity around the world so that we can effectively deal with infectious disease. So I'll be talking a little bit more about the global health security agenda, about the fact that this is a multi-sectoral effort, that we've been very successful in bringing in different entities, that we have to continue to do that, that this is an effort that must go much more than the 5 years that we had initially designed it, and that right now they're actually having their ministerial in Uganda for the GHSA is the fourth one that we're having. Unfortunately, I'm not there, but I'm happy to be here. So that's what I'll be talking about. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Francisco?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Congratulations. 2 reasons. I'm acting for Knowledge Management and Bioethics and Research Director right now. So on top of all the responsibilities in PAHO, which I say I have the much fun part of the organization, and my position sees all the technical issues. So I really have a lot of fun there and a lot of work. But I also, through KBR, I'm responsible for all the collaborating centers. So welcome to one of the 185 collaborating centers in the Americas that we have. Congratulations for that. So we're going to be liaising a lot because we have the responsibility to follow up with some of the issues that you're going to be working here in the region. With all the things that you have heard from the 3 previous speakers, I think that law in public health is getting more and more relevant. And it was very interesting to see this shift in PAHO as well, and in the member states in the Americas. When we started talking about nutrition, we have this conception of public health nutrition, working with malnourishment and all those things that probably are pretty much past history in many parts of the continent, with very focalized issues in some countries. But now, the request for technical assistance in the countries is more into legal issues around nutrition. How can we help countries in having the better law to really safeguard the population? So we're moving into a very technical nutrition aspects to more legal aspects. But it's not only nutrition. Research, bioethics, health systems, NCDs. So the scope is opening for legal aspects in public health. So I think that this is crucial for you to have all this in mind, because we're going to be picking your minds all the time. We have a lot of work here in the region. We have only one lawyer working on public health law, but he works with all the departments. So you can imagine the needs that we're going to have in supporting all this work that we have ahead. And this challenge is one of the challenges that we see in this region. The Americas, as you were saying, we have advanced in so many issues right now. We were the first one to eliminate smallpox. We were the first one to eliminate polio, the first one to eliminate rubella, measles. But still, we have to face all the issues coming, and we have to keep the surveillance, keep working very hard, and be ready for whatever comes. As Dr. Fauci was saying, we are finishing a huge outbreak of yellow fever in Brazil, with all the countries from Panama down in alert because of the potential expansion of the yellow fever outbreak. But we have to be really on top of all these issues on an ongoing basis. So health security is crucial for the advancement of the countries. The new epidemics, whatever may come with arroviruses, which is probably one of the ones we're expecting this year. In 2018, I hope not, but I mean, the history of every year we have had Ebola preparation, then we have chikungunya, then we have Zika, yellow fever, and whatever comes next. Climate change is affecting all this. We have seen that mosquitoes are living in higher altitudes. People are virgin to that, so they're naive to all these infections. So we're seeing changes in all these issues. So we need to really focus, work in legal aspects, be strong in surveillance and epidemiology, and reinforce health systems to really be able to attack all of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Yeah. Thank you very much. It seems like we're cooking something here, and everybody's adding some ingredients into the soup that we're cooking tonight. Very, very nice. I want to add my ingredient, which is that health is a political choice. In the end, we know quite well how to prevent epidemics. So there will be always outbreaks, but how to then prevent that this becomes a global outbreak, we know how to do these things. We actually also know how to bring healthcare to people, how we can finance health services for even poorer countries. And it's therefore surprising that some industrialized countries say that this is not affordable. We know that it's not, that it is, so that this is not true. So in the end, it is a political choice. It's also a political choice to say, what are actually the commercial determinants of ill health? And Francisco, you've just talked about the burden of non-communicable diseases that we face, where we see that because of decisions being taken in other sectors, it's the health sector that bears the brunt of costs. Instead, we could actually make a world that looks at the health impacts of decisions in other sectors, and so that the policymakers in these sectors take at least informed decisions, that they know what the consequences on health would be. We, PAHO and in WHO headquarters, are working a lot with industry. As you know, we're working not only with the pharmaceutical industry so that they make the necessary drugs available, but also, for instance, that the pricing of medicines becomes more transparent, because we know that currently this is very intransparent. At the same time, we're working with industry, food industry, for instance, to see how could we reduce the sugar levels, right? And very often we're still not yet successful because the political choice is not made for health. So I think I'm looking forward to discussing with you all how we could look at the different sectors, how we can make health a centerpiece of that, and how we could have what we call joined up government, so that what is actually important for, let's say, environment and climate change, we look at the health impacts of this climate change at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to invite the panel to take their seats. While they do that, I'm going to add another ingredient to the brew. We've talked about the importance of science, best quality evidence. We've talked about health in all sectors. We've talked about the political implications, the inevitability of an infectious disease pandemic. But one of the things that is at the heart of what the O'Neill Institute does is justice and equity. And for us, global health with justice is critical, because you can have global health in the sense of ever-increasing indicators for health improvement, and it's tracked the Millennium Development Goals, but it could be very unequally distributed, not only among countries, but within countries. Every country from Brazil to Russia to China to the United States, there are major health disparities. So I'm going to pose questions to particular panelists, but what I encourage you to do is ask questions of each other, because it's going to be more interesting if we get a conversation and not just question, answer, question, answer. But I thought I would start with Tony Fauci. You talked about the inevitability of an outbreak. I thought it was very interesting, the narrative you gave about all of the things that happened. I actually thought you were going to say all four things had happened because of Ebola and Zika. But there will be a big challenge. So the question is, what is the greatest threat facing us? You know, we haven't mentioned novel influenzas, for example. What are the lessons learned that you've learned through AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, Ebola, and Zika? And what are the weak links?
I don't think this is working unless I'm not turning it on.
Is it not working? Not again.
Putting it on.
You want to try this one?
That one's working.
While I'm doing that, you could turn this one on.
I can turn this one on. There you go. Okay.
Sorry for impugning his technical capability. It's my fault.
Cyber attack, Tony.
Okay, so 3 questions. I'll try to answer them as succinctly as I can. So when you're talking about infectious diseases, the thing that virtually worries all public health people and scientists and infectious disease person is a respiratory illness that's efficiently spread from individual to individual, and that has a high degree of morbidity and mortality. And that falls under the category of what we have experienced in the past with influenza. I mean, influenza as a seasonal disease has a great global health impact that we generally don't pay much attention to because we're so used to it year after year after year. You know, there are 250 to 500,000 deaths each year in the world due to influenza on a seasonal basis. We all know the terrible history of the 1918 pandemic, where in the population of the world in 1918, there were 50 to 100 million people who died during that period of time of 1918, 1919. So the concern is being prepared for, and I think it was said very well, that outbreaks will occur. It's incumbent upon us to prevent an outbreak from becoming a pandemic. And that's where the lessons learned, which is your second question of me, is that what have we learned over the years in the challenges that we have had? I'm sorry.
This is not working. All right. Try that one, Tony.
Maybe it's the way I'm holding it.
No, I don't think so.
Well, what have we learned from the challenges that we have? And, you know, there are about 5 or 6 issues that clearly come back and stare us in the face after we've been through a crisis, whatever it is, be it SARS or chikungunya or Ebola or Zika, in that there needs to be first surveillance, which the global health security agenda is very much focused on, to be able to detect things early enough so that you could, as we say, prevent an outbreak from becoming an epidemic or a pandemic. Typical example of that is that with Ebola, which turned out to be a catastrophe in West Africa, the first child that was infected in Guinea was in December of 2013. It wasn't until 2014 in March or April did the world realize that we had a problem here, and it was because of one, not only the lack of surveillance, but the lack of communication and coordination and collaboration. So that's the second lesson. The third one is that there has to be interaction among groups. There has to be the interaction between the local public health individuals as well as national and international organizations like the WHO, the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, and others. There also needs to be the ability to respond in a 21st century way. And let me explain what I mean. What we're doing right now is trying to perfect platform technology in diagnostics, therapeutics, but importantly in vaccines. And what I mean by platform technology, instead of every time there's a new microbe or a virus that you have to isolate it, grow it up, inactivate it, or kill it and then have a vaccine. Guaranteed, you will be behind the curve of an outbreak if that's what you have to do every time, which is the reason why we have to do things like perfect platforms like DNA, mRNA, vector-based, nanoparticles, things like that. Those are the things that need to be pursued. And then finally, the thing that we learned in spades with the outbreak of Zika is that we need a stable public health emergency fund, very similar to what we have with FEMA. Some of you may remember the president brought Tom Frieden and I and others into the White House in December and asked, what do we need to respond to the Zika outbreak? We gave him our best guess. He asked the Congress for $1.9 billion in January and again in February. We didn't receive a penny from them until September of that year. So during that period of time, we had to keep draining from other sources of money, which is absolutely unacceptable and a disgrace that we had to have done that. So those are the lessons. And the last question was,
What's our weakest link?
oh, I think the weakest, well, there are several weakest links, but I think one of the important weakest links is health systems within the countries. The best things that we can do, we in the more developed world, is to not only encourage, but help countries and convince countries, and maybe the WHO can help in this, and PAHO, to make the development of health systems a high priority in their country. And when we, as developed nations, go into to help the way we did with Ebola and the way we're doing in many respects with Zika, is to don't just go in, do your thing and leave, but to leave some sort of both intellectual and physical infrastructure. We did that in Liberia through the Ebola outbreak. We trained a lot of people. We helped to renovate some of their clinics so that now, if there is another Ebola outbreak in Liberia, I will guarantee you they will respond in a much better way than they did in the past.
Thank you, Tony. And we're going to talk more about how you build up those health systems with the Global Health Security Agenda, the joint external evaluation of WHO and the like. Peggy, I wanted to ask you a similar question, but on a different topic. So what worries you the most when you were FDA commissioner? And I'll just jog your memory, not that you need it. But there were two things that struck me. One, I had the enormous privilege of chairing a National Academy of Medicine commission that FDA commissioned on substandard and falsified medicines, where we saw a global trade in these medicines that really was truly astounding. You and I both worked in China, the FDA. You were a leader there, trying to get quality assurance there before it came to American shores. So in terms of a safe and effective and high quality and affordable medicines and vaccines, what are your greatest worries?
Well, I think the issues around globalization are enormous and, in fact, growing. And it certainly was something that took me by surprise when I arrived at the FDA. I'd been working on a number of global health issues and the interface of health and security. And I had sort of thought I'd have to put that aside during my tenure at FDA and not really work so much on those issues. And then I realized that if I was going to fulfill the mission of the FDA, which is to promote and protect the health of U.S. citizens, that I had to engage on a global stage in a way that was pretty profound, that the products that we were regulating and that American consumers were using were coming in whole or in part from places all around the world. On the drug side, it was, I think, some 40% of the finished drugs used were being made elsewhere. 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients were coming from outside our borders. On the food side, the numbers were equally astounding, with about 50% of fresh fruit and nuts coming from other countries, over 85% of the seafood that we eat here coming from elsewhere, and often from countries with much less mature regulatory oversight systems, and that the supply chains through which these products were moving were very complicated as well. It was not usually just being made in one country and then coming here, but moving through and multiple distributors and packagers and repackagers, lots of places for the integrity of those products to be potentially compromised, either unintentionally or intentionally. I learned a new term also, economic adulteration, where you make a product in a substandard way because you can save money, and that has led to a number of very sorry scenarios. So it really triggered both a rethinking of how we did things. We couldn't just inspect products as they came over the borders, both because of the huge and growing volume of products, but also the fact that our borders are pretty porous. Others have made that observation in other contexts, but I mean it in a different way. But, you know, there were over 300 different sort of ports of entry, boats, trains, trucks, planes.
Internet.
Internet, which is, you know, one of the biggest challenges, in fact, in terms of what worries me. So what was interesting and where, you know, the law comes in to important medical and public health needs, that we really needed to think and act in new ways and create a new system of really global governance. We had to in some ways work almost as a development agency in terms of helping build capacity, and the partnership with China, I think, was a very positive one, but that we worked in many other countries and with many other organizations, importantly WHO as well as a partner. And people at the FDA would sometimes remind me, we are not a development agency, and you know, it's easy for you to say, oh yes, we'll help, but we've got other jobs at home. But we engaged with different partners in order to help strengthen capacity and develop core competencies, but also to look at how can we share workload and information in new ways, and how do we really create systems that enable individual nations to have their own sovereign legal regulatory systems, but align them and harmonize them to the greatest degree possible so that we can achieve a higher level of safety and ultimately also a higher level of efficiency in terms of both regulatory actions that need to be taken, but also as we think about science as a global enterprise, the ability to work together in terms of how do we develop new critical products, how do we review them, and how do we make sure that their use in the marketplace is appropriate and safe no matter where they're being used.
Yeah, you were a pioneer, and you had the vision of America is safe when we build up systems and quality around the world. And also you mentioned the important point about regulatory pathways, which is also important for vaccines and medicine and including infectious disease prevention. Bonnie, we've already talked about the global health security agenda. In my mind, and I'm sure in yours, because you were a leader of it, it was really transformational, and it was really the epitome, I think, of American global leadership. That leadership is at risk. Yesterday in the O'Neill Colloquium, Ambassador Jimmy Coker said he doesn't think that there's much of a chance at all for the global health security agenda to be reauthorized. He said that nobody's asking for it, not in Congress, not in the administration. And whether that's true, you'll know better, Tony. But we do have a new way of kind of confronting the world. And so reflect a little bit about what should America's role be in the world? How should we lead, particularly in terms of our values and in terms of our trying to be at the forefront of protecting the world? And of course, no better example of that than PEPFAR and the absolutely transformational work that we did with AIDS.
Okay, I'm not sure where to start with that one. As far as I guess I'll start with the broker's comment. One thing that we have seen is we have had a number of our current leadership support global security agenda. We've had some concerns, of course, with the president's budget and what that might do in terms of health. And happy to see that there's been some pushback by Congress on some of the proposed cuts, which is a positive thing. We have had Secretary Tillerson say that supporting the global security agenda. And we had our former HHS secretary also supported at one of the WHO meetings this year. So in that sense, there have been some statements by the administration supporting the global security agenda. We've had some proposed cuts, which hopefully will not go through. It is true that we haven't had enough conversation on the Hill, I believe, about the issue of global security agenda. I think there is definitely a desire by a lot of people who have been engaged in the GHSA, particularly outside the government, that this continue in the future, because it's very important to have U.S. leadership. However, one thing that has been very important about this effort, and I think answers some of your question, is that we have also pushed leadership from other countries as well. We've had a number of countries like Finland, Indonesia, South Korea, Uganda, a number of countries around Japan, around the world who have taken a leadership role in this effort to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease with the recognition that this is a global concern. Sometimes leadership means not always being in front. Sometimes leadership means working with people and helping other people be in the front. So where in this administration we're not the leader, we can rely hopefully on others promoting other countries to take that role until we can more responsibly take the role that we should be taking or have taken in the past. The GHSA was definitely something that was launched. When it was launched, we had 22 or so other ministers here in 2014. But as I said from the very beginning, we had leaders from other countries. We've had leadership from the WHO, from the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, Organization of Animal Health, have been very instrumental in this effort. They've worked very closely with us. We continue to work closely with them. And so this effort has been one, as I said earlier, that's been bringing together different entities, both government, outside government, and international organizations. So I would prefer that the U.S. continue to be a leader on this. I would prefer that the U.S. continue to be a leader in a lot of things that we have not been a leader in recently, that we would abide by our past agreements as an international law. I'm very much committed to the idea of staying committed to the agreements that we make and the commitments that we make under these treaties and conventions. But in the meantime, until we can hopefully get back to when we do that, we have to lead from behind, and we have to lead working with other countries and other organizations who still hold the goals and the commitments that we had when we first agreed to launch some of these things.
And of course, our leadership starts with the incredible acumen and scientific skill of NIH and CDC. But of course, the Public Health Prevention Fund for the CDC is at risk, which could really affect our global presence and our ability to work country level. So lots of threats in the future. Rudiger, the two things that you said that intrigued me. One is that health is a political choice. So why are we not making the right choices, or are we? And then the second is that really health is not necessarily primarily even a health sector issue. It's a cross-sector issue. So lots of times people will ask me, what is the one thing, if you could wave a magic wand and you could answer this question, maybe that one thing that would improve the health of the world? My answer to that is educate women. Not in the health sector, but it seems to me obvious. So talk about the politics and talk about cross-sectoral cooperation.
Yeah. Why are we not making the right choices? That's sometimes I believe that we're not making we're not telling the right stories, right? So you look at your country here, you're one of the countries with the highest rates of child obesity. And this is, by and large, because junk food is available everywhere in this country. And so your kids go to school and the junk food is just around them. And especially for children who come from families who are not so wealthy, right? So from poorer families. So, and if we went back to the roots of public health, you have pioneers like John Snow in the UK. What did he do? There was this cholera outbreak. I don't know if you know the story. There was a cholera outbreak in London.
The Broad Street pump.
Exactly. So what did he do? He was actually doing, he actually looked at where were the cases of cholera. And then he came to the dwell and he took the handle off. Right? So that's what he did. Translated to today's world would mean that we're mapping the availability of junk food for kids. And you would find here in Washington certain areas where you get more junk food than in wealthier areas, in geographical areas in Washington. And what you would do is put the handle off, right? That means that this food is no longer available for these children. You would talk to your mayors and you would say, listen, that's unacceptable that we're doing this, because a 3-year-old cannot make a healthy choice, right? What this 3-year-old would do is eat what is tasty and what is available, right? So whereas the same was true with the water in the dwell for the London people there, they just needed water. They didn't know that this was contaminated, right? So sometimes I believe we're not telling the right stories. We're not engaging with the right people who take those decisions, right? If you banned junk food 500 meters around every school here in Washington, the world for children would look differently.
It would.
You said we should speak up.
Please do.
Can I just make a comment,
Please.
having sort of been through the nutrition wars a bit as FDA commissioner? You know, I think you've mentioned talking to the mayor. I think it's also engaging the public and educating the public, because the greatest changes in nutrition policy were much facilitated by consumer demand. And we fought hard with companies to do things like eliminate trans fats, lower sodium, change the nutrition facts label so that people could understand how much added sugar. But it was where the public was saying, this is what we want, and where they were gravitating towards products that were already making some of these transitions, where we were able to then, using legal tools and regulatory tools, to actually then, sort of institutionalize some of those changes. But, and this is a bigger problem about how do we make sure that the public, really understands some of these issues, and how do you bring, quality science and science education to bear on some of these problems. But the consumers, drive decision-making in ways that I saw were very, very powerful.
They do, and, it reminds me, I'm going to be turning to you, Francisco, for NCDs and food, Mexico was the pioneer with the soda tax. New York Times recently had a big expose about obesity in Brazil, in your region. Of course, on cholera, we still see it in Yemen, Haiti. So over a century ago, John Snow was able to stop it. We can't. We've got plague in Madagascar.
And didn't they initially put the handle back on, even after
They did.
studies?
They did.
Yeah.
Yeah. He had to fight them really hard.
He had to fight them, sure.
So, Francisco, I mean, I don't know whether to ask about NCDs, but since you're here, how could I not ask about Zika? If you think about Brazil as the epicenter and the Olympics, if you think about the Caribbean, and if you go into the region and you looked into the eyes of a poor woman who was pregnant or thinking of getting pregnant, and the sheer terror that she had, and our inability to stop that vector, what was all that about?
It's on.
Okay, now. Well, that's a nice, challenging question, Larry. And I'm going to start with something that my colleague from WHO didn't answer, which is the intersectoriality. And I think that this is crucial for addressing any problem in public health. And I think that if we were able to push forward health and health policies, and to really have other sectors thinking about health and the potential impact on health, we'll have a better outcome everywhere. And I want to link it to this with Zika, because Zika is, I mean, as Dr. Fauci was saying, health sector is the one that pays the whole consequences of other sectors not doing their work. So environment is something that is not strictly related to health sector, but it has different sectors having an impact on the environment. We have seen the changes in environment, and we know that now that Aedes doesn't breed only in clean water, is breeding everywhere. So they're adapted to the environment very quickly. So that's a challenge. Then something that happened in Costa Rica to really lower down Aedes number of mosquitoes was that they involved other sectors in the control of where these mosquitoes were breeding. And that really had a positive impact in decreasing dengue, and that Costa Rica had very few cases of Zika and chikungunya. So that's something that when they, you know, all these places with all the old cars, all the wrecked cars from the highways, they put it all together. They're in a tropical climate with a lot of rain, you have a lot of water there, and an incredible breeding site for mosquitoes. So the Ministry of Health managed to have other sectors involved, and the other sectors really put their t-shirt on and started working, and dengue went down. But when you go to rural areas where you don't have proper roads, when you don't have water pipe water, so you have water deposits that they depend on it for drinking water, then you have all these problems with mosquito breeding, and then you have Zika. And then you come to these women, and they start knowing about Zika. At first, they didn't know what was going on. So the word starts spreading that Zika is affecting children, mothers that are pregnant. So you can really feel the fear of these women and different approaches by the different ministries. So ministries saying, don't get pregnant, but they were not offering any family planning advice or support. Some others not really attacking the issue strongly. And there was a lot of uncertainty. And but when you go to the poorest of the poor, which are the ones being affected, you come into an outcome of a baby with microcephaly that's going to be needing a lot of support. Support not only from the health sector, that the health sector might provide, in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of psychological support to the family and the kid. And probably, if they can provide it, it will not be close to where these people live. So they will depend on social sector to get some support in monies to transport them to other places where hopefully the services will be available. So this will bring a challenge to the social sector, to the health sector, and to the educational sector. How can we link all these things to really strengthen what the health sector has to do in terms of psychological support, in rehabilitation, in social welfare to support these families, which is going to be a burden to them, how to bring the educational sector in providing specialized training or specialized programs to these children as we were speaking before all this started. So when you see these poor women facing all this, it's a responsibility of the government to say, yes, we're going to be helping you. If the government doesn't really do that, these children, these families, these women will be really forgotten, and they will be, really the burden on the families, economic, psychological, will be huge. So I think that this is a very good example of how intersectoral work should be facing these kind of problems that we have. The epidemic wasn't wartime, but the consequences of the epidemic in terms of children with microcephaly will be for these families a long, long burden for them to carry on.
It will, and of course it links with Peggy's point about reproductive health and Rudiger's point about social determinants, Tony's about vaccines, and diplomacy. So I'm going to step back now, see if the panel has questions for each other, and then bring the audience in.
Yeah. First of all, I think, Francisco, you're absolutely right. It's bringing the different sectors in. But our experience also tells us in the last 25 years that we were very often telling the other sectors what they should do, and then we were quite disappointed if they didn't do what we asked them to do. So I think from that lesson, it's much more to engage with the other sectors to look at their agendas. So to not try to overrule their agendas, but tune in with them. And that's something that very often we're not very well trained in doing. So that's something I guess we need to take into consideration there.
Yeah, and just to amplify what you said, it's so true. I've been heavily involved in the response of the Zika outbreak in Puerto Rico, which had their own set of problems. The idea about bringing the different sectors together is so easily said than done.
Yes.
It was almost impossible to get any sector involved agreeing with each other. Should you spray? Should you not spray? Should you provide birth control or not? Should you advise women not to get pregnant during a period of time? And it was just total argument back and forth, and nothing happened.
Yeah.
It was really unfortunate to view that and be on a conference call 2-3 times a week trying to get something done and realize that it's just not going to get done. So, I mean, I totally agree with you that getting the different sectors to work together is sort of the utopian goal. Whether or not we're going to get there, it's going to be tough.
And while you've got the mic, Tony, just like I had to ask Francisco about Zika, I have to ask you about dual-use research, bioterrorism, enhancements, biosecurity, including at CDC and NIH, in terms of inadvertent escapes. Peggy's been involved in this very much so too. Talk a little bit about what you see as the threats that might face us from an intentional or an intentional attack or an unintentional escape.
Okay, so let's just focus it on biologic in the sense of microbes, because there's differences with regard to air and chemical. But if you just look at microbes, is there a threat of deliberate attack? Yes. I hope I don't offend people in the biodefense, bioterror arena to say that always the threat of a naturally occurring catastrophe totally trumps the threat, no pun intended with that Trump, but totally trumps the threat. But the threat is not absent. There is clearly that possibility. But the preparation from a pure medical standpoint, now you were talking about law enforcement and all kinds of types of things that go beyond trying to stop the perpetrator before they start. That's clearly important. But the preparation for a biological threat that's naturally occurring versus deliberately released is very, very similar. That's the perpetrator. the accidental one can occur. I think we have maybe spent a little bit more emphasis on the likelihood of it occurring than it actually occurring. Dual use research, for better or worse, occupied a considerable part of my
I know,
life.
that's why I asked. You probably better explain what
Yeah.
that is.
Okay, dual use research
gonna
is
open that up.
working with a microbe for the purpose of trying to do something better for society. At the same time as that experiment, if gone awry or if a mistake is made, could actually be to the detriment of society. And one of the examples that triggered all of this was when the H5N1 threat of the bird flu, which you know was jumping from a chicken to a human. It did it inefficiently, and human to human was extremely inefficient and almost did not occur at all except with some outliers. The thing about the H5N1 is that when it did jump from chicken to human, the mortality was 33 to 40%, which is astounding when you think of seasonal influenza, where at best the mortality is a fraction of a percent, and even in the pandemic flu of 1918, the mortality was 1 to 2%. So we get very concerned about manipulating an influenza to possibly allow it to be more efficient in going from human to human. So a series of experiments were done by some individuals, which was to ask what would the mutations be to allow it to spread more efficiently in a mammal model, namely from one ferret to another. So what they did is they played around with a bunch of mutations and said, these are the mutations that are associated with greater transmissibility, for the purpose of saying, let's look in the environment, and when we see these mutations around, we might respond in a more efficient and a more rapid way. That's the good news part of it. The bad news part of it is that if you make mutations, somehow or other it accidentally gets out, you could have a man-made pandemic.
And you're publishing it, and it might
Exactly.
be available to other actors.
Exactly.
And your point that was in Nature, right? So that's your example. The interesting thing is that we in WHO were informed by Nature once the article was for publication. So there's a big issue with regard to governance here and to research ethics.
Right. So we have, there's a terminology that we use called a culture of responsibility. And we liken it to what happened during the early years of the molecular biology and the 1970s, when they had the famous Asilomar conference, where the scientists got together and said, we need to monitor ourselves so that we don't do something. We can never stop the bad guys from doing bad guy things. But what we can do is create a culture of responsibility so that we don't inadvertently do something that turns out to be detrimental. And we can put some regulations and some guidelines, and as a result of that incident that you referred to that was published in Nature, we now have a series of procedures and steps that, rather than wait until something is ready to get published and say, oh my God, we shouldn't be publishing that, it's going to get into the hands of the bad guy, is don't even fund the experiment before it even gets done. So we can do that in the United States, but that is only the control that we have when it's federally funded. All of the other sources of funding can do what they want to do, but it's a good start.
It's a very good start. Okay, so I'm going to make an executive decision, and I'm very sorry for the audience. I'm going to ask Peggy and then Bonnie to wrap up, and then we're going to go straight to the reception without the questions. My apologies to you, but we want to keep roughly on time, and I don't know about you, but I just love hearing the panelists. So Peggy?
Okay.
There's one right next to you as well.
Okay.
Mike, yeah.
Well, I actually had wanted to tell a brief story about when cross-sectoral work can actually make a difference to sort of bring a note of optimism and possibility, and to build on Rudiger's comment about the importance of political commitment and will. And this goes back to when I was health commissioner in New York City, and I think it was when we first met, when to my astonishment, I found myself struggling with a dramatic resurgence of tuberculosis in the city, and not just tuberculosis, but drug-resistant, often multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. And I had only learned about TB as a disease of historical interest as a medical student to start out. Never thought it would be occupying so much of my time. But, you know, we very quickly learned that, you know, we had a very big problem on our hand, but we had insights about how to address it. But the problem was that as the health department, we only could take a limited set of actions, even though we did have some powerful public health law. And what was really required was to be able to work across components of government and sectors of government, and as well as raising awareness. And I went to Mayor Dinkins, and I was helped by the fact that the New York Post had a big story saying killer TB on subways, and that sort of got his attention. And I said, you know, I think that we can deal with this, but we have to have your support. We have to have a strategic plan with clear goals and objectives, and we have to be able to make sure that all of the partners are pulling in the same direction, that everybody knows what they're responsible for and accountable. And he actually did something which in government is very unusual, and it ruffled some feathers initially, but I think, you know, the proof was in the pudding, and we turned the epidemic around very quickly, much more quickly than we thought we could. But he made me the TB czarina. Lovely plaque that I have to this day, Dr. Hamburg, MD Czarina. But he gave me the authority to put together a comprehensive budget across all the components of the city government, which are normally stovepiped. And people initially thought I'd be putting all the money into the health department, but in fact, most of the investments were outside of the health department. And what probably made the most difference was our determination to move away from armory-style shelters to single-unit or family apartment shelters, to make sure that in the criminal justice system, particularly Rikers Island, that there was appropriate respiratory isolation for patients with TB, appropriate diagnosis, and also ongoing care to link individuals going out of the criminal justice system into the community to care in the community. And I think, you know, that was a critical part. The other smart thing that I did was to hire Tom Frieden to run our TB program. He was a young epidemiology intelligence officer at the health department. He'd done a study which actually provided the evidence, the data for action in terms of the rates of drug resistance. And that was very important. So I hired him, and people said, why are you hiring a 12-year-old to run the TB program? He looked like he was 12 then. He tried to cover it up with a mustache, but it didn't work.
Right. Think about it. I mean, New York City Health Department, Peggy Hamburg, Tom Frieden, Mary Bassett, I mean, all incredible.
It's the greatest health
It is
in the world.
It really is. I'm sorry to say it, but it is true.
Well, I don't mind hearing it because I'm from New York, so it's okay. Just a couple of things. One, to go back on biosecurity. That's really has been my entree into this whole issue of global health security. And one thing that has been really useful that the GHSA has done, has made biosecurity one of the action packages of the GHSA. And for those of you who don't know, there are a number of action packages which are very important, because not only do they provide specific areas where countries have to work together with other countries and within their own countries to strengthen capacity, but it provides actual steps on how they're going to do it, measurements for how they're going to measure it. And so by having biosecurity as part of one of those areas, it has made it mandatory that countries strengthen their biosecurity. There are a lot of places in the world where we have labs that are not secure at all. Unfortunately, we don't have bad actors in every part of the world, but there are a lot of places in the world where pathogens are not secure like they should be. So this is very helpful in that respect. And just to go back to the multi-sector issue, there's nothing that can take the place of strong leadership, as we talked about in a strategy. And I think we have an example. We talked about multi-sector and some of the problems that there are in doing that. And one of the reasons why I think it's been very useful in the global security agenda is because we did have such strong leadership and we had a strategy. And the strategy is in the action packages. The strategy is having a 10-member steering group that meets 3 times a year of countries. We have a direct relationship, as I said earlier, with the international organizations. And we have the leadership from the other countries, not only in the general work, but also in the action packages themselves. So it's been very helpful in providing that multi-sector engagement, not only within countries, but also across countries. We're developing relationships, ministries with other ministries around the world. So it's really been helpful to break down some of those barriers and create some of the multi-sector relationships that you really do need to combat issues like infectious disease. Thanks.
Well, I could listen to this panel all day. I don't know about you, but I think you may realize the privilege you've had to be in this room with these people. What we've learned, it's scary. It's vital to our health and our future well-being in the United States and globally. And please join me in just giving a really wonderful round of applause for our panel. And now I think Oscar and Katie, we're going to the reception. Is that the idea? Yes? Okay, good. We can break.